After nearly 400 years of neglect, misrepresentation and marginalisation, the recovery of a more balanced perspective on the Anabaptist movement during the past 80 years has been an impressive accomplishment that owes much to the research and scholarship of various Mennonite historians, and more recently to the contributions of certain secular historians. This recovery has passed through a number of stages, and each has contributed significantly to the process, as well as arguably misrepresenting the sources and requiring correction from others. The main stages can be considered under the following categories. First, antagonism, misrepresentation and marginalisation. Second, monogenesis, recovering authentic Anabaptism. Third, polygenesis, diversity and fragmentation. Lastly, beyond monogenesis and polygenesis, recovering Anabaptism again. We will explore each of these stages in this unit. First, antagonism, misrepresentation and marginalisation. According to historian Sonia Riddoch, historical judgments regarding the Anabaptist movement have ranged over a broad spectrum of opinion and have reflected the period in which they were written, along with the interests of their authors. She continues, in the 16th century, Anabaptism was associated in the public mind with the horrors of Münster. To Martin Luther, Anabaptists were swarmer, fanatics, enthusiasts, zealots, and the target of some of his most vitriolic condemnations. For 4 centuries after the emergence of the Anabaptist movement, most scholarly and popular accounts were primarily based on the overwhelmingly negative evaluation of the movement by its Catholic and Protestant opponents. This treatment, as noted in the previous unit, is a further example of a familiar pattern in the interpretation of radical movements. Writings of the Anabaptist leaders were ignored, more positive evaluations of the movement were dismissed, and the story was told with sufficient selectivity to ensure that Anabaptism was seen in the worst possible light. Reading a typical account of Anabaptism in a church history textbook during this period would suggest that the main features of the movement were subversive and revolutionary activities under the malign influence of Thomas Müntzer, unbridled spiritualism and religious fanaticism, wooden literalism in the use of scripture and excessive legalism, readiness to resort to violence despite professions of pacifism, and the debacle at Münster, characterised by oppression, polygamy and unbridled millennialism. If Anabaptism was not described in this way, in other textbooks it was ignored or dealt with as a dismissive footnote. Generations of students of church history were not encouraged to explore Anabaptism or engage with its ideas, except through the writings of its opponents. There were occasional exceptions. Lord Acton, a 19th century Catholic writer, claimed rather surprisingly that Anabaptism and similar movements were one of the great generative factors in modern history and a turning point in the epic of modern history. Although this stage is largely in the past, it is still possible to find contemporary accounts of the 16th century Reformation, especially less scholarly accounts, that appear to be based on these older textbooks and that present a similarly one-sided and negative appraisal. But during the first half of the 20th century, despite continuing antipathy, especially from Lutheran scholars such as Karl Holl, who continued to characterise Anabaptists as Luther had centuries earlier, several scholars challenged the way Anabaptism was being described and presented a very different picture. Ernest Payne, a British Baptist historian, was an important contributor to this, but undoubtedly the most significant figure in the rehabilitation of Anabaptism was Mennonite historian and church leader Harold Bender. The impact of his landmark speech, The Anabaptist Vision, is hard to exaggerate. This is the starting point for our second unit.